Paris, March 1815. Europe's most powerful leaders were celebrating the end of a nightmare when a single messenger burst in, carrying news that hit the hall like a cannonball. Napoleon had returned. The emperor wasn't running. He was gambling everything on one final, brilliant campaign: strike two armies, Wellington and Blucher, before they could unite and crush him. This is the story of how two unlikely generals, a prudent duke and a vengeful 72-year-old marshal, were all that stood between Napoleon and a second French Empire. Could they keep their promise to link up, or would one of history's greatest military minds tear them apart in a single, desperate weekend? The great powers of Europe were gathered, not for war, but for the grandest ball of the season. They were deciding the fate of the continent over crystal glasses and velvet gowns, confident that the nightmare of the French emperor was finally over. The celebrations stopped. The violins fell silent. In an instant, the Congress of Vienna dissolved into panic and fury as the Allied sovereigns realized that the man who had shaken Europe for 2 decades was back for his final desperate gamble. They immediately declared him an outlaw and swore to combine their forces to crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew he could not defeat the combined might of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. His only chance was to strike with lightning speed, defeat the two closest armies, the Anglo-Allied force and the Prussians, before they could link up, and shatter the coalition's fragile unity. He was betting everything on one final, brilliant campaign. To face him were two men who could not have been more different. First, the Duke of Wellington, commander of the Anglo-Allied army. Pragmatic, cautious, and intensely proud, the Iron Duke viewed war as a grim business to be won by superior positioning and stoic defense. His army was a composite force, a core of British veterans mixed with Dutch, Belgian, and German troops of highly variable quality. This international coalition was notoriously unreliable, relying on Wellington's reputation and iron discipline to hold together under fire. The Duke trusted his soldiers, but he deeply mistrusted the quality of many of his allies, a tension that added immeasurably to his burden. The second was Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the 72-year-old commander of the Prussian army. Marshal Forwards was a living monument to vengeance, fueled by an almost primal hatred of Napoleon and a fiery, relentless, aggressive spirit. He was an officer of the old school, leading from the very front, his presence often more inspiring than any official order. His troops were dedicated to their aging, beloved commander, but their ranks were still recovering from previous defeats. Filled with new recruits and Landwehr militia forces, whose grit was untested against the fury of the French emperor. These two men, the prudent general and the charging veteran, were the cornerstones of the coalition, and their single shared objective was the key to Europe's future. They had to keep their two armies linked at all costs. Napoleon, meanwhile, mobilized with terrifying speed. He gathered an army of 125,000 veteran French troops, men who believed in the emperor and his invincibility. This force was a spectacle of centralized power, loyal and eager to follow their emperor one last time. By June, he was marching north toward the border with the newly formed Kingdom of the Netherlands, aiming straight for the junction point between the two Allied armies. His plan was simple and devastatingly effective. Use a central thrust to punch through the Allied line, divide Wellington and Blucher, and then turn and destroy each army in detail. He believed the Prussians, having suffered under his heel for years, would be easier to break first, while Wellington, positioned further west to defend the route to Brussels, was the secondary target. The campaign of 1815 was now a race against time, with the fate of every empire hanging on the ability of two disparate generals to keep their word. The focus of this opening chess game was a set of 4 crossroads in modern-day Belgium. Napoleon's first move was a feint, crossing the border near Charleroi and driving a wedge between the Allies. The early speed of the French advance stunned the Allies. Blucher, eager for a fight, ordered his army to concentrate around the town of Ligny, committing his troops to a fixed battle with dangerous speed. Wellington, ever cautious, finally decided to hold his ground further west at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, a critical junction that controlled the main road north to Brussels. The initial failure of Allied communications and reconnaissance had already handed Napoleon the crucial advantage of surprise. By the afternoon of June 16th, the initial clashes had begun, and the fog of war had fully descended. At Ligny, the main French force, led by Napoleon himself, crashed into the Prussian lines. The battle was a brutal, swirling melee fought across several hours. The Prussians, positioned in the villages and farmhouses, fought with desperate courage, but Napoleon's concentration of force and his superior artillery broke their defenses piece by piece. Blucher, leading from the front with characteristic recklessness, urged his men to hold every inch of ground, personally directing counterattacks that showed his fiery spirit. Napoleon committed his reserves, including the terrifying Young Guard, and slowly ground the Prussian army down, village by village. The final French assault broke the Prussian line, turning a defeat into a rout. Blucher's horse was killed beneath him, and he was nearly captured, only saved by the quick action of his aide-de-camp and the gathering dusk. It was a decisive French victory, confirming Napoleon's military genius. Meanwhile, just 8 miles, 13 kilometers, away at Quatre Bras, Wellington was fighting a separate, equally desperate battle. His troops were scattered and arriving piecemeal, but they managed to hold the vital crossroads against the French left wing, commanded by Marshal Ney. The battle saw repeated, furious French attacks against the small corps of British, Brunswick, and Dutch troops. The British infantry, forming the famous thin red line, held firm, repulsing cavalry and infantry charges alike. The ferocious Major General Sir Thomas Picton, renowned for his foul temper and cold courage, played a vital role, leading a successful counterattack that stabilized the British line. Though he would ultimately fall in the fighting, Wellington had successfully held his objective, denying Ney the junction point. However, his success was overshadowed by the devastating news from his ally. With Blucher shattered and retreating, Wellington realized he was exposed and in immediate danger of being outflanked by Napoleon's main army. He quickly ordered a general retreat north to a pre-selected defensive position just outside the village of Waterloo. The crucial difference in the outcome of Ligny was not the defeat, but the retreat. Blucher, despite his severe losses and near-death experience, kept his promise to Wellington. Instead of falling back east toward his supply lines and away from the field, the logical, self-preserving move, Blucher ordered his battered, exhausted troops to retreat north toward Wavre. This was the movement that would save Europe, as it kept the Prussians on the same axis as Wellington, ensuring they could still link up. Napoleon, believing the old Marshal was broken and fleeing east, detached Marshal Grouchy with 30,000 men to pursue and destroy the retreating Prussians. This was Napoleon's critical misjudgment, underestimating the tenacity of his foe. Napoleon then turned his full attention to Wellington, confident he had already defeated one army and was about to destroy the second. He had no idea this broken army was about to pull off a 72-hour march of pure vengeance that would decide everything. If you're captivated by these moments when the course of history hinges on a single decision, consider subscribing to our channel. We explore the battles, the turning points, and the figures who dared to change the world. Now, back to the ultimate gamble. June 17th saw an intense downpour that turned the Belgian countryside into a miserable swamp of thick, heavy mud. The retreat of the Anglo-Allied army, pursued by Napoleon's main force, was a dreary, exhausting affair. The torrential rain was more than just a misery, it was a factor of destiny. It slowed Napoleon's pursuit, preventing a full-scale assault that afternoon, and, most crucially, gave Wellington the time he needed to settle his forces onto his chosen ground. By the evening, Wellington's army was arrayed along a low ridgeline near the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, just south of Waterloo. Napoleon's massive force camped across the valley, a short distance away. The rain had bought Wellington time, but it also created something else, a mud-soaked hell that would soon swallow the charges of the world's most elite cavalry. The night of June 17th was one of cold discomfort and existential dread. Allied soldiers huddled in the waterlogged fields, their muskets covered to keep the powder dry. Wellington's army was a thin, fragile line, outnumbered and reliant entirely on the promise of a vengeful old Prussian. The mud made a night attack impossible, but the dawn promised a battle of total destruction. The fate of the battle, and of the coalition itself, would rest on whether Blucher could keep his word, and whether Wellington could hold on until the Prussian guns were heard on the horizon. The tension was palpable. The soldiers knew they were standing on the threshold of the final, decisive confrontation. Dawn broke on Sunday, June 18th, 1815. The heavy rain of the night had given way to a dismal, overcast morning, and a thick, soupy mud covered the battlefield. Wellington's line stretched for about 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers, along the crest of the ridge. In a stroke of tactical genius, he placed the majority of his men behind the ridge, using the natural contour of the land as a shield. This reverse slope defense was Wellington's trademark. It concealed his forces from the lethal French artillery fire, and it masked the true strength and composition of his army. From the French perspective, the ridge appeared sparsely defended, a bluff designed to lure Napoleon into an ill-conceived frontal attack. Wellington anchored his position with 3 key strongholds: the chateau of Hougoumont on his right flank, the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center, and the farm of Papelotte on the left. Hougoumont, in particular, was the scene of an all-day, desperate siege. The Duke intentionally reinforced the position, knowing that Napoleon, seeing a walled, strategic target, would be unable to resist attacking it, thereby drawing in French reserves and diverting the main assault. The attack began around 11 o'clock in the morning, a feint designed by Napoleon to test the Allied line. The skirmish at Hougoumont quickly escalated into a brutal, intense battle that lasted for the entire day, consuming thousands of French troops and vital reserves that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. The defenders, mostly British guards, held the chateau against wave after wave of French assaults, turning it into a fortress of flesh and stone. The fighting was visceral, doors were battered, buildings were set ablaze, and the contest for the walled compound became a battle of sheer attrition and will, a fiery, miniature war consuming the flank. The main French assault began midday with a massive artillery bombardment, which was largely ineffective against the Allied troops hidden behind the reverse slope. This was followed by the mass charge of Count d'Alon's massive infantry corps. As the French advanced up the slope, they were met by the Allied infantry emerging from the crest, forming their ranks in the iconic, devastating squares. The British infantry, led by the stoic veterans of the Peninsular War, held firm, delivering punishing volleys into the dense French formations. The sound of thousands of muskets firing in unison, the ripping noise of organized slaughter reverberated across the valley. It was in the early afternoon that Marshal Ney, perhaps suffering from the confusion of the moment, misinterpreted a movement in the Allied rear as a sign of retreat. Without waiting for orders, he launched what would become one of the most famous and most foolish cavalry charges in military history. Thousands of French cuirassiers, heavy cavalry, and lancers thundered across the valley and surged up the muddy slope. They hit the Allied infantry squares like a devastating wave of steel and horseflesh. The sight was terrifying, armored French riders crashing into walls of bayonets, but the squares held. They were immovable islands of defiant men, presenting a hedge of steel in every direction. The French cavalry could not break them. They reformed, charged, and were repulsed again and again, wasting precious time and exhausting the elite French cavalry for no gain. Wellington, watching the heroic endurance of his troops, remained a pillar of resolve, but his line was stretched to the limit. The cavalry was beaten, but Wellington's center was paper-thin, and the Emperor still had his final, ultimate weapon locked away. The Duke looked east, knowing that his line could not survive another hour without the sound of Prussian guns. While Wellington's Allied forces were being systematically battered on the ridge, the Prussians were engaged in their own grueling, desperate race against the clock. Marshal Blucher, having given his promise, was determined to keep it. The retreat toward Wavre was not an easy one. The heavy rain had turned the roads into a punishing, chest-deep mire. Every horse, every cannon, and every man had to fight their way through the suffocating mud. Blucher himself, still battered from his fall at Ligny, was a relentless engine of will, driving his troops forward. The memory of their defeat, coupled with the old marshal's fiery rhetoric, spurred the exhausted Prussian corps onward, determined to exact their terrible revenge. Their objective was to hit Napoleon's right flank, a movement that would force the emperor to commit vital reserves to two fronts and ultimately decide the battle. But they were being delayed by Marshal Grouchy, who had been sent by Napoleon to pursue them. Grouchy, believing the Prussians were making a general retreat, had wasted precious hours engaging the Prussian rearguard at Wavre, a strategic error that completely removed his 30,000 troops from the main battlefield. He was fighting the wrong battle at the wrong time, 8 miles, 13 kilometers, away from the decisive point. His failure to march to the sound of the guns was the critical mistake that would cost Napoleon the war, a dereliction of initiative that forever stains his name. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, the first sounds of battle not from the main ridge reached the ears of the French command. Initially, Napoleon dismissed it as grouchy, but the cannon fire quickly grew louder and closer. It was the 4th Prussian Corps, commanded by General Bülow, finally emerging onto the French right flank. The sight of the distant Prussian flags, dirty and tattered but undeniably present, was the miracle Wellington had been waiting for. For the Allied soldiers clinging to the ridge, it was the first true sign of hope after a relentless day of fighting. Napoleon had no choice but to divert precious reserves, including 2 divisions of the Young Guard, to contain this new threat at the village of Plancenoit. The ensuing battle was a ferocious struggle for the small village, a secondary engagement that became the key to the entire field. The Prussians, fueled by sheer rage and led by Bülow's relentless advance, pushed hard, fighting house to house. As the Prussians pushed harder, Napoleon's focus was split. Every man committed to holding Plancenoit was one less man available to break Wellington's line. The emperor was forced into the nightmare scenario he had tried so desperately to avoid. He was now fighting a 2-front war against 2 concentrated armies. The arrival of the Prussians was the turning point, but the battle was far from over. Wellington's center was crumbling, and Napoleon still had one weapon left. As the evening approached, the fighting was at its absolute peak. Wellington's line, having endured hours of incessant pounding, was faltering. The pivotal farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte had finally fallen to the French, leaving a gaping hole in the Anglo-Allied center. Wellington rode constantly up and down the line, urging his men to stand firm. What will they say in England? He is famously reported to have asked his troops, instilling his own relentless stoicism into the exhausted men. Napoleon, sensing the moment of collapse, decided to play his final card. He recalled his ultimate weapon, the legendary Imperial Guard. These were the veterans, the immortals, who had never been broken in a frontal charge. Their very presence was meant to be a psychological shockwave that would shatter the remaining Allied will. As the Guard formed their magnificent columns and began their slow, deliberate march up the ridge, the entire battlefield paused. The sun was setting on the carnage, and this was the moment of destiny, the final throw of the dice that would decide the fate of the entire continent. The Emperor himself rode out to address the Guard before their advance, giving them a brief, fiery speech that promised victory. They began their march toward the Allied line, led by Marshal Ney, now on his 5th horse of the day, in a final, defiant push that aimed straight at the exposed Anglo-Allied center. The air was thick with smoke, and the setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows. As the Imperial Guard reached the crest of the ridge, they expected to find the Allied line in disarray. Instead, Wellington played his last, perfect hand. He commanded General Maitland's British foot guards, who had been lying prone and concealed on the reverse slope, to rise and fire a devastating close-range volley into the astonished French column. The sheer shock and power of the sudden, unexpected fire shattered the leading ranks of the Guard. A massive, disciplined countercharge followed. The sight that followed was unthinkable. The Imperial Guard, the invincible veterans, faltered, turned, and began to fall back. The cry immediately erupted across the French lines, "La Garde recule," the Guard recoils. It was a cry that instantly transformed the battle. If the Guard could be broken, then the cause was lost. Panic seized the French army. At the same time, the Prussians, having finally broken through the defenses at Plancenoit, surged onto the battlefield. The weight of the coalition, 2 entire armies, was now fully engaged against the exhausted, demoralized French. The French line collapsed into a general rout. Napoleon himself was forced to flee the field, protected only by a few squares of the old guard who fought to the last man to cover their emperor's escape, refusing to surrender their standards. The pursuit was taken up by the Prussians, driven by Blucher's relentless zeal and determination to allow Napoleon no peace. They chased the fleeing French for miles into the darkness, turning the rout into an unmitigated disaster for the French army. At about 9 o'clock that night, Field Marshal Blucher and the Duke of Wellington finally met near the farmhouse of La Belle Alliance, the center of Napoleon's former position. Their handshake, reportedly awkward yet sincere, symbolized the triumph of coalition over genius and the end of the Napoleonic dream. The victory was absolute, purchased at a terrible cost of tens of thousands of casualties. The story of the thin red line holding the slope, the fury of the Prussian charge through the mud, and the unthinkable sight of the Imperial Guard recoiling, remains a powerful testament to the necessity of perseverance and the triumph of coalition over genius. The battle, fought on a small ridge in Belgium, became the graveyard of an empire and the decisive pivot point for the next 100 years of European history. If you found the drama of this campaign gripping, share this video with another history fan. And let us know in the comments below which other incredible historical moments deserve this kind of deep, cinematic dive. Waterloo was a collision of giants, a chaotic dance of fate fought across a single muddy field. If you want more stories about the desperate gambles and world-changing victories that forged our modern world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us next time as we explore another incredible piece of history.